A truck idling in Germany looks like its cab and trailer were poured from the same mold, while a truck idling in Texas slams a flat, slab-sided face straight into the wind, and one of those two countries has been obsessing over that difference for 50 years longer than the other. Somewhere in that gap sits a story about fuel tax, speed limiters, and a length law that has nothing to do with either country simply being smarter than the other. If you think aerodynamics is a modern trucking trend, wait until you hear how far behind America actually was, and what finally forced it to catch up. And if you're into the hidden reasoning behind how these machines get designed, stick around and subscribe, because that's exactly what this channel covers. So tell me in the comments, did you know European trucks were shaped this way on purpose decades before American trucks caught on? What changed in the 2000s that finally forced American manufacturers to care about drag? And why might the shape of a European truck end up being the shape of every truck, everywhere, before long? Before we get into why Europe got there first, we need to understand what aerodynamics actually costs a truck once it hits highway speed. At low speeds, most of the resistance a truck fights against comes from rolling resistance, the friction between the tires and the road. But somewhere around 55 to 60 miles per hour, air resistance starts to dominate the equation, and it does not scale in a friendly, linear way. Drag force increases with the square of speed, which means that going from 55 to 65 miles per hour does not add a little more resistance, it adds a lot more. For a vehicle the size and shape of a semi-truck, that matters enormously, because a conventional slab-fronted cab is, aerodynamically speaking, close to the worst shape you could put on a highway. It is basically a brick punching a hole through the atmosphere for 10 hours a day. Now here is where the story starts to split. In Europe, trucks have been legally capped at around 90 kilometers per hour on the highway for decades, a limit enforced electronically through speed limiters fitted at the factory. That sounds like it should reduce the pressure to worry about aerodynamics, since lower speeds mean lower drag. But the opposite happened, and the reason is fuel economics. European diesel has historically carried much heavier taxation than American diesel, sometimes nearly double the price per liter once you account for regional fuel duties. When your top speed is fixed by law and your fuel is expensive no matter what you do, the only lever left to pull for saving money is reducing the energy it takes to move the truck through the air at that fixed speed. So European manufacturers turned aerodynamics into a genuine competitive battleground, because a 1 or 2% drag reduction translated directly into fuel savings that operators could feel in their monthly costs, year after year, trip after trip. Add to that the length restrictions we have talked about before on this channel. A European tractor-trailer combination is capped at roughly 18.75 meters total, which forces the cab itself to be as short and compact as possible so the trailer can carry more cargo. A short, flat-faced cab-over design is not just about maximizing trailer length, though. It also happens to be far easier to smooth into an aerodynamic shape than a long hood with a separate engine compartment sitting out front. European manufacturers essentially got a two-for-one deal. Shrink the cab for regulatory reasons, and end up with a shape that is naturally friendlier to airflow as a side effect. So by the 1970s and into the 1980s, Scania and its Swedish neighbor were already running vehicles through wind tunnels, refining roof deflectors, curved fairings above the windshield, and side skirts along the trailer to keep turbulent air from tumbling underneath and dragging at the rear axles. Roof-mounted air deflectors became standard equipment because engineers could measure, in controlled testing, exactly how much smoother the air moved over a cab when the leading edge was rounded instead of squared off. Trailer side skirts followed a similar logic, closing the gap between the ground and the underside of the trailer so that less air could get trapped and churned up as the vehicle moved forward. None of this was marketing fluff. Fleet operators in Europe were running the numbers constantly, and a manufacturer that could demonstrate a measurable fuel saving at a fixed 90 km per hour cruising speed had a very persuasive sales pitch. Meanwhile, in America, the picture looked completely different. Diesel was comparatively cheap for most of the 20th century. There was no federally mandated speed limiter forcing every truck to cruise at the exact same number, which meant drag reduction competed against other priorities like raw horsepower and hauling capacity. And there was no length restriction squeezing manufacturers into a compact cab-over shape, because the 1982 regulatory change that reset American trailer length rules explicitly excluded the tractor from the measurement. A trucking company could run a massive, roomy, long-nosed conventional cab and still fit a full-length trailer behind it. Under those conditions, there was simply no financial or regulatory pressure pushing anyone to chase the wind tunnel numbers the way Swedish engineers had been doing for decades. The American truck stayed a brick, because for a very long time, being a brick did not cost anyone very much extra money. That started to change once fuel prices climbed through the 2000s, and once federal regulators finally stepped in. The Environmental Protection Agency and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration jointly introduced greenhouse gas and fuel efficiency standards for heavy trucks, with the first phase landing around 2011, and a much stricter second phase following roughly 5 years later. For the first time, American manufacturers were legally required to hit specific efficiency targets, and aerodynamics suddenly became one of the cheapest and fastest ways to close that gap without redesigning an entire engine platform. That is the exact moment you start seeing side skirts, roof fairings, and gap reducers between the cab and trailer show up as standard equipment on American highway trucks, features that had already been common on European roads for a generation. Freightliner's aerodynamic package on its flagship long-haul model, and similar systems from Volvo's American division and other manufacturers, were essentially catching up to a toolkit that Scania and its neighbors had already validated through decades of real-world fleet data. One detail illustrates this timing gap particularly well: mirrors. Traditional side mirrors on a truck are surprisingly disruptive to airflow, creating turbulence and drag right at one of the most sensitive points on the vehicle. European manufacturers began experimenting with camera-based mirror replacement systems years before American regulators allowed anything similar on public roads, because European type approval processes gave manufacturers more flexibility to introduce that kind of change. In the United States, digital camera mirror systems only started appearing as factory options on select models in the past few years, following specific regulatory exemptions that had to be worked through first. It is a small piece of hardware, but it captures the larger pattern almost perfectly. European trucking treated aerodynamic refinement as an ongoing engineering discipline for half a century, while American trucking treated it as a box to check once the rules finally demanded it. None of this means American engineers were behind in raw talent or ambition. The truth is closer to the opposite of a stereotype people like to repeat. American manufacturers had genuinely excellent engineers who simply were not being asked to solve this particular problem because the economic incentives were pointed somewhere else entirely, toward comfort, toward hauling capacity, toward the raw drivability that owner-operators wanted on long, flat interstate corridors. Once the incentives shifted, thanks to fuel prices and federal mandates, American aerodynamic development moved remarkably fast, borrowing heavily from the European playbook because that playbook already existed and had already been proven across millions of highway miles. And now there is a new force pulling both sides of the Atlantic toward the same conclusion, and that force is electrification. A battery electric truck does not have a fuel tank you can simply make bigger to extend range. It has a fixed and very heavy battery pack, and every bit of energy lost to aerodynamic drag comes directly out of that limited range. Suddenly, drag coefficient is not a nice-to-have efficiency bonus. It is one of the single biggest levers an engineer has for determining how far a truck can actually drive on a charge. Electric truck prototypes emerging from American manufacturers have chased dramatically lower drag coefficients than anything in the conventional diesel lineup, borrowing design language, smooth nose shapes, and enclosed underbody panels that look far closer to a European cabover than to a traditional long-nosed rig. It is a strange kind of full-circle moment. The shape that European regulations and fuel taxes forced into existence decades ago is turning out to be almost exactly the shape that battery range now demands everywhere else in the world. What this really comes down to is a lesson we keep running into again and again when we look closely at trucking. The machines are never just the product of engineering talent working in a vacuum. They are the product of whatever pressures happen to be pressing down on an industry at a given moment, whether that pressure comes from a speed limiter, a fuel tax, a length restriction, or a federal emissions target. Scania and its Nordic neighbors did not develop sophisticated aerodynamics because someone in Sweden woke up one morning obsessed with airflow for its own sake. They developed it because the economics of their market left them no other realistic option. America eventually arrived at the same conclusions, just on a delayed timeline, once its own economics finally pointed in the same direction. And now, electrification is quietly erasing whatever gap was left, because a battery pack does not care which continent designed the truck sitting on top of it. It only cares how efficiently that truck can cut through the air in front of it. So the next time you see a modern American highway truck with a smoothed hood, a tucked-in bumper, and side skirts running the length of the trailer, you are not looking at a purely American idea. You are looking at the tail end of a 50-year European head start, one that regulation, fuel prices, and now battery range have finally forced the rest of the world to take just as seriously.